Hello and back again. So we are cruising right along in the semester. Um, we have a few weeks left, and I am encouraged and excited to see the ways in which many, or most of you all are really taking to the course material and really engaging with it in honest and serious ways. Contemplating the implications not only for for academic purposes but also for purposes of your own personal lives. For me, working through these theories was therapeutic because it helped me understand um, my life in ways that I didn't understand before. In many ways, this work could be considered a form of narrative or cognitive behavioral therapy, where we're challenging or affirming, you know, thoughts and feelings that we have about ourselves in the world. Um, and so, so I'm just encouraged and really also learning from you on what you are kind of making sense of the course material yourselves. Now, this week, let me go ahead and share my screen. We're going to be working through um, Black male studies and Black feminism. Now, most of us are probably already familiar with Black feminist thought. It's probably been since the early 1980s with a since the early 1980s kind of the leading theory, not only in Black studies as a discipline, but also one of the foremost, most impactful theories in the discipline, but also extending into like women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies. Black feminist thought has really shaped and molded many disciplines, beyond just Black studies. It's through the experiences of Black women specifically that many groups kind of understand themselves and the relationship they have to kind of the center of power, which is generally framed as kind of patriarchal, power or patriarchy, uh, where the architects of modernity being, rich white Protestant males. Um, they are the patriarchs, depending upon like how your the ways in which you show up in the world intersect with those the patriarch determines your status or place in society. This is where you get concepts like intersectionality, um, that kind of are playing on this idea that we have intersecting identities that either give us status or privilege in a society versus maybe disadvantage in a society. Now, so that's kind of one of the more popular ideas that's coming from the Black feminists that you probably have already been engaging with, have made popular, likes of Bell Hooks, um, Michelle Wallace, and the I don't know why intersectionality. Oh, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the folks who was uh, who helped popularize that term in her work, the idea of intersectionality. Um, so you're probably already familiar or will become familiar with these ideas, not only in the classroom, but social media. So ideas like patriarchy, misogyny, toxic masculinity. It's kind of the more popular kind of discourse that's coming out of Black feminist thought and feminist thought, in general. That's also informed feminist thought, or vice versa, as we'll see with kind of the arguments posed by Black male studies theorists. Now, I'm not interested in any of those kind of more pop culture related dynamics within that have emerged through Black feminist stuff. Um, So the theories that we're going to be working through aren't necessarily are examining the experience of Black people centering the Negro problem. So again, how the ontological status of Black people in relationship to others, or the othering of Blackness that was necessary for the creation of European modernity, both economically and psycho-social. As we consider the works of Franz Fanon. The Black feminist thinkers that on the table here, so you're not going to, they may allude to ideas of intersectionality, but that's not at the forefront of what they're up to. They're really just considering the position of Black and the relationship and the status of Black women within Europe, this European and Western modernity. So there are two theorists on the table here that we're going to be engaging with, or y'all are going to be working with, and that's Hortense Spillers in the article Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book, and then a video lecture by Saidiya Hartman called Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments. These two theorists, these two intellectuals are inspired the work of Afro-pessimists like Frank Wilderson. So through reading kind of the tension between the Black female body and Western modernity that that inspired or became the ingredients for ultimately Wilderson's concept of Afro-pessimism. So it's drawing from the works of Hartman and Spillers that, and their work cited the ways in which they arrive at this kind of this dynamic and this the status of Black the Black female body within kind of again Western modernity that Wilderson arrived at Afro-pessimism and basically the out-group status of all Black people regardless of gender. Now, let me share Celia, this lady girl. So one of this tension around gender is something that Black feminists, Hortense Spillers, Saidiya Hartman are kind of engaging with. And you can think of it, there's like two, for both Black male studies and Black feminism, there's three kind of three they're up to kind of three primary things. And now for Black feminism, one is kind of the idea of feminism or Black femininity. So it's challenging the idea of Black femininity that has been propagated by Western modernity. So the stereotypes of Black female bodies is definitely on the table that have been codified in the work of intellectuals, anthropologists, sociologists, where they have supported the notions or advanced the ideas of the Black female body being basically simply the antithesis to white femininity. So the ways that has been articulated over time. So that is definitely a critique. So that is that challenge to Western modernity, or a critique of Western modernity and how its interpretation of the Black female body. In the article, you'll see this idea of body, flesh. Now you can think of the body as the physical aspect, the empirical, or the phenomena, the physical aspect to which we draw or interpret reality, being the more symbolic, non-physical aspect of reality. Again, what we've been referring to is this idea of recognition, this idea of kind of symbolic social constructs, the symbolic social constructs. So the invented, the interpretation of a reality. is what we can think of as kind of, in philosophy, they call it maybe the mind. Um, in this article, Hortense Spirlers refers to it as the flesh. Flesh. So even in 1865, the Black body was free physically by law. The Blackness itself, the flesh, kind of, again, this idea of Blackness, this universally accepted idea of Blackness was still chained, was still shackled to the ideas of Blackness that were invented or constructed in European and Western modernity. So we see Blackness itself was not liberated from the idea of itself. So we see, and the impact that had, the residual impact. So even in post-slavery, post-emancipation, we still see this violence, this perpetuation of kind of this idea, this flesh, the myth, the story, this fantasy of Blackness that that continued up into uh, the present. If this idea of the Negro problem remains to be true. So we have to, as Sylvia Wynter was attempting to do one of her interventions, is untethering us from this kind of universal concept of reality or interpretation, the story of reality, the interpretation of it, where we look at the world, existence itself, through the ideas of the West. So we interpret reality and its many inventions, its many stories, sub-stories, even gender through the ideas of Western modernity. So we're examining how, so the gender and how we read or articulate gender is through a Western lens or the master script. And what are the implications of that? That's on the table for Black femininity. So one of the things, another kind of strand within Black feminist thought is basically once you untether Black femininity from the West, from this Western lens, what do you see? So this idea of waywardness, Black femininity exists ontologically wayward from gender and femininity as constructed by the West. It's wayward. And in its waywardness, kind of like what Fanon was kind of alluding to in the potential, the generating kind of potential, the zone of non-being, the space creates an opportunity for something else to be imagined or is already being imagined. So Black femininity is wayward to Western femininity or femininity as produced within that group of those who are said to be human. And that's a good thing. That is for Hortense Spillers and Sadia Hartman. That's a place like Fanon. That's a place where existence itself. That's a place where a pure potential, where this authentic upheaval, as he said, could be born. So at the same time, Black femininity is also asking, basically, quite simply, what is Black, what is femininity? What is gender to Black people? What is femininity to Black women? If The experiences of Black women, although may mirror the experiences of, let's say, those who belong within Western modernity, part of the in group, there may be some overlap. But when you study history, we can't assume that it's a same gendered experience. Black women have always been working. So the question of, this idea of women entering the workforce has never been something. Black women have always been in the workforce. They've always been part of the labor force. They've had to, either by choice, by force or by choice. The ways in which Black women produce or make gender is a question for Black feminists. The question isn't for these feminists, kind of like as you see in pop culture, the ways in which, Black masculinity and femininity are seemingly at war with each other. No, we assume this feminist, Hartman and Smillers assume we exist together in this outgroup category. So yes, we can kind of think about the nuances or even the tensions that exist between these groups or these categories or subcategories of Blackness. But those tensions are the result or the aftermath or the effect of social death. It's the effect of this persistent violence, this persistent dehumanization being exacted on Black people um, um, within society. So it's not, the what the longing or what they hope to come out of this, of kind of this reading of Black feminism in the female body isn't, to shame Black men. It's to challenge all of us to rethink our commitment to reality itself through the lens, through the writing, through the female body, the flesh. When you think about so again, when we think about both Black feminine, Black male studies, on the table again is kind of this challenge to the master script, the tension around the body itself, and then the uh, uh, the unique experiences. So part point again, continual point two, this kind of unique nuanced experiences of bodies who are deemed socially dead. And then it's quite simply, what is Black femininity? What is Black masculinity to those deemed socially dead? Uh, how are we making and producing or inventing gender if we believe we have agency? So it's kind of an optimist, kind of overarching kind of sentiment or internal kind of sentiment that there's embedded in it is this idea of optimism, or assumed to be this, assumed within these Black feminists and even Black male studies, is this optimism that Black people are producing meaning for their lives that is distinct from just trying to reproduce, mimic whiteness, as Fanon argued. Mimicking whiteness does Blackness no good. And Black people are already up to making meaning for themselves. So as we see, here's an example of Celia the Slave. And this is an extra credit opportunity in the module that if you want to take on, we see legally through the experience of Celia, a slave girl. Oh, what happened? Okay, I have to post a new. So Celia was a slave girl who, as a teenager, raped, killed her master. her rapist. Um, now, uh, what's important here is this. Let me see. Let's go to a quick kind of excerpt of this particular example. Uh, so you can see right here in this picture. So this is kind of just a quick overview of this particular case. She killed her master, uh, who was raping her. But in the state of Missouri at this time, it was the 1800s. There was a law that women in such circumstances of rape can, in acts of self-defense, kill the perpetrator. But the court ruled that Celia, because of her status as slave, as Black, she was not a woman and not protected by this law. So she was excluded, her ontological status excluded her from recognition within kind of the legal recognition in society more broadly, but also in the case of jurisprudence, where she wasn't protected by law. Now this makes me think about the ways in which Black people still, find themselves unprotected by law. And the question again is why? Where at the time, in the 1800s, it's more blatant in terms of why. They're more upfront about kind of their interpretations of reality and beliefs about reality. Whereas now it's more codified. But again, what's important here is that she was not, even although she shared the same anatomical features as white women, white girls, children, she was not protected under law, not only from this ideas of raping a girl, a child, but so it wasn't an act of statutory rape. It wasn't child molestation because she wasn't even a child. Again, going back to this idea of social death, this idea of natal alienation and general dishonor. So the rules that apply to those who exist within modernity, those who belong to, quote unquote, this human family, do not apply to Black people. So Celia was not considered a woman by law and by thought. Laws are the just the manifestations of people's thinking around ethics and morals. So laws don't exist; they are invented. So within this again construct of modernity, within the political form, the political institution, she was not protected, and in fact, she was ultimately hung and murdered. Um, you know, and we're talking about a teenage girl. So I'll post this as extra credit for you to kind of think about and write about as well. This particular instance. Um, so when we think about, kind of more broadly and how this general discourse about gender equality, as you'll see in the article, Mamas, Babies, Papas, maybe when we think about these things in kind of universal ways, we miss the nuances that ultimately end up reproducing anti-Black violence. Black women will tell you, even those who participated in the recent women's rights, this women's march movement, um, you know, many Black women left those those marches and protests, like discouraged, because even 20 into the 2020s, Black still finding themselves isolated, even within spaces that are supposed to embrace them. So many Black women left there dissatisfied, disenchanted, and outright angry by the fact that, again, this nuanced experiences of Blackness and its effects on one's reality is still not being acknowledged within these general categories, even in these progressive or these marches for social justice or social change. Now, um, for Black feminism, again, I'm not interested in intersection, the general kind of, those buzzwords. That's not on the table. It's not. You'll get that in all your other classes. Here, we're assuming the Negro problem to be true, and in fact, informing the experiences of people in society today. And therefore, we can't assume that the status of, the, the general kind of these general categories in which we think about these things to apply to all people. We have to sit with or be attentive to the nuance Blackness has on one's experience and reality or status in the world. So on the table also is the article, the essay opens up with the many different ways in which Black women have been stereotyped. This idea of flesh that continues the fantasy, the myth around Black female body and the stereotypes and tropes. This is how the essay opens, with these tropes, these ideas that a lot of Black women are familiar with, in terms of these kind of tropes about being mammies or sapphires. So we see that these kind of the legacy of slavery and really going back to that slave strip and the birth of modernity continue to haunt Black women today, even though physically might be, no longer shackled. Celia may not be shackled physically, but the ideas about who she is ontologically remain and continue to haunt Black women, even as Black women are navigating society, seemingly navigating society in ways that are, might cause us to think, wait a minute, the rates of which Black women are, navigating even higher education, the workforce, business, it appears, at least on one hand, that Black women are making moves. I was reading one article that said that Black women are the new model minority because of now it's seemingly, at least on one hand, their ability to successfully kind of move and integrate into society in ways that Black men haven't. But if you were to ask the majority or many of these Black women if they were free, if their status, their incomes, if they were free, I would argue that many would say no. And that they still, even though they might be at college educated, have doctorate degrees, be doctors, lawyers, again, these titles and have this prestige, they still haunted by these tropes about what it means to be, these tropes about the Black female body. So I'm curious to see what you all do with this piece. Now, Black male studies is the one of the strands of Black male studies. One of their interventions is to challenge these ideas of femininity, of feminism itself. So for Black male studies, we see since the 1980s, again, like I was saying, feminism now, uh, it, uh, the ways in which feminism has influenced and shaped kind of academia, um, and influenced the ways in which we have recharted or recharacterized or characterized the Black male body. So, Black male studies is challenging, is a direct challenge to postmodernity and this postmodern term, which, while incorporating kind of the nuanced realities of those that may exist, is challenged to Western modernity by different categories, that by folks who may have existed on the margins of kind of the patriarchal center uh, of power. Thinking about categories of again women, in the 60s and 70s, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, kind of this immigrants rights movement, even kind of the at the less uh, even though it's not as this anti-capitalist critique or the poor people's movement. We don't see much of that today. But this postmodern turn, this challenge to Western modernity and their notions of truth, um, emphasizing this idea of relative truth, that different groups make meaning for their lives. And these meanings are nuanced, yet Black or feminism and this kind of gender turn, um, uh, it ultimately began, or at least didn't begin, but was also invested in the reproduction of what anti-Black misandry is, what Dr. Tommy Curry refers to it as. So how under this kind of matrix, this emerging matrix of like feminist thought, we see the lingering kind of, again, this flesh, these ideas around the Black male body, and how um, much of this fight around gender and gender equality, or the tension of gendered bodies, um, was underwritten consciously or unconsciously by uh, this kind of fear of the Black male body, or was underwritten by the same logics of Western man, or man two, man one and man two. So the assumptions kind of about the Black male body remain true even as many of these groups emerge to challenge kind of Western man's status as kind of king of the throne. Uh, we see a perpetuation of the idea of kind of the boogeyman, or scary Black man, or this predatory Black man, under the code name of toxic masculinity, under the code name of hypersexuality, uh, under the code name of patriarchy. So again, when you think about the idea of gender, if Black women were excluded, Black female body was excluded from this status of gender, then logically, well, I mean, then we would, you could just assume that Black men were also excluded from the category of gender as well. So Black masculinity, you could argue, is the antithesis of white masculinity. So whatever white masculinity is, uh, Blackness is the antithesis to it. So for the ideas of white masculinity to exist, or whatever that means, um, there has to be something that doesn't exist within that category. And that something is Black masculinity. So again, when we think about gender, and we don't think about gender through the nuance, or think about gender, that nuance that even somebody like Winters was arguing in terms of groups, people making meaning for their lives, you know, before the invention of Western modernity or European modernity, or even, as some of you have suggested, even concurrent to Western modernity, that groups of people are making their own modernities, even in the present. Um, the but not by not acknowledging these nuances, you know, consciously or unconsciously, or even well-intended folks ultimately end up, reproducing anti-Blackness and specifically anti-Black misandry. So you're not going to hear, if you take a gender studies course, you're not going to hear about Black masculinity or masculinity, period. It's going to center femininity, or kind of the ways in which gender is being questioned by different groups with trans, or trans folks, and non-binary folks. But you're not gonna, on the table isn't going to be masculinity, and if it is, it's going to be critique, uh, especially if masculinity shows up in quote unquote its cis form. You might even be exposed to a kind of a pop culture article that titled "Cis Black Men Are the White Men of the Black Community." It's a pop culture, it's a blog post that even academics are using to kind of read and to articulate or teach about gender. But you can't assume, especially if we take this idea of the Negro problem seriously, um, then to assume, to flatten gender in this way, um, does an extreme disservice to those practitioners who are invested in trying to solve the problem. Practitioners, including mental health therapists who are trained uh, in these theoretical lenses. So these lenses that don't acknowledge, one, the Negro problem, and don't acknowledge the nuance. So you can go to a therapist as a poor working class Black man, victims of all kinds of trauma, and still be called a patriarch, or considered a patriarch, or toxic. Teachers are being trained with these logics. There's no helping professional. There's no theory that you're going to learn in your academic journey, regardless of your trajectory, that's not going to be informed by kind of these logics. So Black male studies is critiquing these logics, and not just based upon kind of opinion, or even though you can kind of this general intrinsic questioning about gender, just reading history, or if you think about it like this, historically, you know, the greatest threat to any empire uh, are males who don't belong to that empire. So if you want to maintain your empire or your power, the greatest threat to your power, if it's males, you're going to do everything in your power to suppress that threat. That's, history teaches us that. So whereas women and children were allowed to integrate into growing empires or colonial forces, Uh, Men were not. They were murdered. But Black male studies draws from examples in history to come up to arrive at its claims, and it also draws from just data itself. So, for instance, for so quick. So this was a presentation that Dr. Tommy Curry did. He's the architect of this growing um, this growing uh, theory. Um, he's in his 30s. Dr. Tommy Curry, was a debate champion, national debate champion, and he actually had to move out of the country. He now is in Europe to do this work because of threats he was getting, um, and threats from feminists, and because his ideas were challenging, beliefs, institutionally accepted beliefs. So these ideas, he wasn't getting traction institutionally here in the States. So he had to go to Europe in order to continue his work. But so this comes from a lecture he did as part of a program that I had done at Grossmont a couple of years back. But here, and basically all he's doing is presenting the data on things that we again assume to be true. So in this particular table, we see instances of sexual violence, physical violence, or by an intimate partner. Now, this is for women. So this is again broken up by this is broken by race, but this is the prevalence amongst U.S. women. Again, control disaggregated by race. So the we see the estimated number of victimization over the lifetime right here in this category, uh, this column. So we see that for Hispanic women, the estimated number of victims is close to 5.5 million. For Black women, it's 6.6 million. For white women, 30. For Asian, American Indian, and multiracial categories, you see those numbers there. Now, again, just by the sheer population size, that may explain the incidence of victimization of white women, right? But how the experience of white women become the lens in which we view the experiences of all women. If it's a higher prevalence of victimization um, experienced by white women, then we just assume that that's the same or shared experiences of all women. But let's look at the category. Let's look at this broken down for men. So again, the prevalence of violence experienced by men, disaggregated by race. So for Hispanic males, estimated number of victims 5 million. Again, compare that to Hispanic females 5.4. And what does that tell us? For Black men, estimated number of victims 5.1 million. Again, compare that to Black women 6.6 million. Again, what does that tell us? White men, again, white male victims of intimate partner violence 23 million. Compare that to white women 30 million. So how is it that we create these ideas about violence and basically label women, the sole, we create these titles, these ideas um, about violence and who's victims and who's perpetrators, and we just call um, that that don't acknowledge the experiences of male victims of intimate partner violence. Males in your, as if you may have already experienced or as you will experience in your academic lives, are always positioned as perpetrators of violence. We don't have theory, gender theory, uh, that that accepts the possibility that males could be victims of violence, intimate partner violence, even sexual violence. Yet, if we look at the numbers, you can't assume the victim or perpetrator of intimate partner violence based upon um, um, gender or gender category, male or female, because the numbers tell us that there's parity between victimization and perpetration, and victimization, at least for this table, um, or these two tables, uh, uh, is is males and females. There's parity. So to assume that when we're talking about gendered violence or intimate partner violence, sexual violence, to assume that it's, males are perpetrators and females are victims, how are we missing these nuances? And then ultimately, how is this informing our practice and interventions that, as helping professionals or those who are trying or may possibly want to getting into become a helping professional? How is this informing our thinking about kind of the problem and then potential interventions? So Black male studies is just basically bringing in data to support their questioning of these assumptions being made, or these claims and arguments being made by feminists, um, again, that have been integrated into kind of academic spaces to inform practices that ultimately just regenerate ideas about Black men being these hypersexual super predators. So when we see a Black male being murdered by the police, on one hand, we're we on one hand, it creates a dissonance because if what we're saying about the Negro problem is true, Black males pose a threat to not only uh, civil society itself, but pose a threat to me as an individual. So when I see a Black male being murdered by the police, I might be able to pity that male on one hand, but on the other hand, there's another thought that says, whether it's conscious or unconscious, you know, that death, that extermination of that Black male, whether right or wrong, justified or not justified, um, um, is provide safety and security for me on an individual level. So it eliminated a potential threat to my life. Again, we're talking about the excess. So although the Black male body was freed during, after the Civil War, he was not freed from the idea, the myth around, or the fantasy around Blackness itself. questions, you know, around or kind of again these general ideas around gender and how it shows up and impacts one's life, income. Uh, if you factor in Black males who are again no longer exist, or Black men who have been exterminated through death or exterminated and placed into the prison industrial complex, Black men make in terms of around 51 cents to every dollar a white man makes. It's the lowest of all people. But yet, when we think about, again, these ideas of income and how gender impacts our income, we just assume that women make less than men. But again, when we look at the nuances, we see that that's not the entire story. And Black male studies is arguing that was intentional. Kind of erasure of this nuance allowed white women and other categories of whiteness that were marginalized from the centers of power to claim this idea of victimhood, of minority status, to then reap the benefits. So we see who benefited the most from even like affirmative action in the 1980s and 90s. And ultimately, I think who's going to benefit the most from this recent, Black Lives Matter protest isn't going to be Black men or Black people. It's going to be everyone else who are considered, who had minority or marginalized, other marginalized categories that, again, exist within modernity or part of this idea of human family. So white women benefited the most, reaped the rewards from affirmative action. Uh, and other categories of whiteness. And I believe that's going to even be true, it's going to be true, as we see the data come out on kind of the impact Black Lives Matter had on society. It's not going to be Black people who ultimately reap the benefits. It's going to be other categories who exist within modernity, like, gendered categories, sexual orientation categories. And so this is what Black male studies is up to. Again, this nuance, just like Black femininity. Now there is tension between because Black male studies is challenging feminism and even Black feminist thought and thinkers who are also invested in perpetrating and reperpetrating these ideas about Black male masculinity being toxic and all this stuff. You do see this tension exist between Black male studies and the Black feminist thought and thinkers who are more, who are more popular, Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw's, or Michelle Wallace's. But you're not, folks, or engaging kind of Black feminist thought. Generally, those are going to be the sources that they're going to be drawing from. You're not going to hear Sylvia Winter. She's not a Black feminist, but she's definitely a Black woman involved in this work. So you're not going to hear her you're not going to hear her. You're not going to get exposed to her work. You're not going to get exposed to the work of Saidiya Hartman and Hortense Spillers. Why? Because they're just not parroting, these ideas that ultimately end up supporting the agendas of non-Black people and their interests. They're not, they're centering Blackness and its reading of society and the experiences of Black people. So I think that's all I had. I apologize. I was rambling. Sometimes when I'm in the classroom and able to engage with y'all, with questions and answers, and it's easier but then just sitting up here and talking without that engagement. But I think that was all I had for you for this particular module. Um, Black male studies, I will say, is an emerging field of study. So if you're interested in the implications for Black male studies, go beyond, in some ways, Black men, because it is a post-colonial theory. So it's reading of society is from a colonial lens. So when we think about the implications of that particular lens, we see that uh, it's colonized out group males. So whether that be here or South America or Asia, um, wherever kind of colonial empires have stamped their flag, we see that it is the outgroup males, those who don't belong to the regime, who experience the highest levels of violence. And again, we know it makes sense as to because those it's the outgroup males that pose the greatest threat to the the agendas of that colonial um, that to the colonial to the empire. So uh, to the ends, the desires, the goals, and the aims of you know the colonial, the colonizing. Uh, so in ways in which female bodies, even though they may be positioned on the outgroup, they're able to be assimilated into the, the, the colonial structure, although may not be able to achieve the center of power. The outgroup male, whether that be Black male, again, regardless of where that male exists in the world, as long as they're outgroup to the colonial structure, if they don't belong within that structure, uh, they're going to be they're going to pose the greatest threat to that agenda, the colonial agenda, and therefore, they're going to be experience the highest levels of violence. So that theory is called social dominance theory. So when we think about this in relationship to the experiences of other males who have been deemed kind of under the rubric of feminist thought, machismo, uh, toxic, all these ideas. When you think about machismo, we're thinking about the implications for brown populations. Uh, we see similar levels of violence being exacted on brown male populations as Black. So when we think about mass incarceration or this kind of targeting of brown males, you know, uh, that explains it. Social dominance theory explains kind of why brown males or uh, Latinos specifically are targeted. Or if you go like Asian males are targeted. Um, but again, under the rubric of feminism, Latinos are deemed machismo. So again, this dissonance that's created where at one hand they're deemed as the problem, and then at the same time we have this idea, very real realities of their lives when they're targeted in ways that Latina Latinas aren't. So what do we do with that? So Black male studies is an attempt to center the experiences of Black men um, to not only within a structure of within a colonial kind of under reading of society, but then also in terms of what are how to also emerging kind of again through Black male studies this idea of what is Black masculinity to Black men. So Black men are producing, they're not just mimicking white men as for suggested or argued. You know, I think kind of with the side eye or in jest in some ways. Um, but black men are doing something else with masculinity, and they are making meaning for themselves beyond just parroting white masculinity, as uh, as argued by uh, feminist thinkers who label black men as toxic masculine, which means which they define as basically black men's desiring to be like white men. So I'm again curious to see what you all do with this. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. This was a lot to unpack, and but yeah. Uh, all right, we will see you next time.